We are all here for the second part, which will be on energy efficiency. And as I explained this morning, we'll start from our guest speaker and then we'll move on to the session with the panelists that are already with us. Let me start by briefly presenting our keynote guest speaker for the session on energy efficiency. It's a real pleasure to have Anna Alberini with us today. Anna is professor in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland. She got a PhD in economics from the University of California, San Diego. She's an environmental and energy economist with a broad range of interests that go from health and safety to non-market valuation. She has worked in particular on residential energy demand, energy efficiency decisions, and vehicle fuel economy and driving decisions, as you will see in a second. Given her expertise, Anna is also in the editorial members of some of the top energy journals, the Energy Journal, Energy Policy, Energy Efficiency. She's also chair of the American Statistical Association's Advisory Committee to the US Energy Information Administration, and she worked for 2 periods at the US Environmental Protection Agency Science Advisory Board. I'm very happy to have Anna here also because I had the opportunity to listen to her as a keynote speaker in the past, for instance, with the Italian Association, and very grateful to her because she basically had to wake up very early, being on the other side of the world, and on top of that, it's Thanksgiving Day. So I feel a bit guilty, to be honest, but nevertheless, I'm so happy to have you here that the gratefulness prevails. Anna, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. I would like to let you know that I'm a morning person, so I get up early anyway, so absolutely no problem. Now, the only concern I have is that I'm broadcasting from the kitchen. My husband is still sleeping. I hope I'm not waking up the neighbors, but we're not going to worry about that. I'm going to be starting to share my slides, so give me just 1 second to work out the technicalities here. You probably can see my email. Can you see my slides now? Can I get from Simone
yes.
Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna put them in presentation mode. Here we go. So the title of and I'm gonna be minimizing pictures here because I have a very small screen and they take up a lot of room. So the title of my presentation is Drive Less, Drive Better, or both. We're gonna be talking about behavioral adjustment to fuel price changes in Germany. So this is going to be a broad conversation that I'm going to be having with you, summarizing a little bit the literature that looks at the fuel economy of cars, which is how we normally term the concept of energy efficiency for cars. We're going to be looking at how it responds to price signals. And so I'm going to be summarizing a little bit the state of the literature as I see it. And then I'm going to be presenting some research that I'm currently doing in hopes of casting light and asking questions on what we can do on this particular sector. This research, the new research, is going to be co-authored with Marco Orveth and Colin Vance. They are at RWI Essen. Before I get started, there's something that I need to say, and I need to do this every single time I'm on a Zoom call or I do a presentation or a keynote speech. I live next to a fire station, La Stazione dei Pompieri. So that means that I have ambulances, fire engines, the firefighters going down the Connecticut Avenue here with full sirens. If that happens during the presentation, I will mute myself for just a few seconds, and I don't want you to think that they're coming to get me. It's probably just some other emergency that they're taking care of.
Don't worry, we had Paul Atkins this morning with a rebuilding works next to his house. So that's the beauty of going live now.
I feel that I should warn you just in case, but hopefully that's not going to happen. Thank you for your patience. And Simone, if you want to give me a heads up, like maybe 5 to 10 minutes before my time, just in case I lose track of time. I only had 1 cup of coffee this morning, so keep that in mind. Worry. So I'm going to be starting with a simple definition. So what's energy efficiency? So we're defining energy efficiency as the ratio between useful work and the energy input that is required to do that useful work. So in this example, because we're talking about cars, useful work could be something like driving 15 kilometers. If the energy input required to do so is 1 liter of gasoline or petrol, then epsilon, the energy efficiency, is going to be 15 kilometers per liter. We also call this fuel economy. That's the expression that you hear all the time in this particular arena. The bigger epsilon is, so the bigger the energy efficiency, the happier we are, because to do the same distance, to cover the same distance, we're going to be using a smaller amount of energy input, or with the same energy input, we can drive a longer distance. Now, most of you guys, if you recently bought a car, are probably used to the idea, are used to the notation that is used in Europe. So in Europe, typically when you buy your car, you're going to be looking at the fuel consumption rate. That's 1 over epsilon. And in that particular case, the smaller number is good. A smaller number is good because it's indicating that you're going to be needing less fuel to cover the same distance. Now, remember that we're interested here in reducing emissions. And so if the energy input is a fossil fuel, improving the energy efficiency should help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, people have been talking about energy efficiency and fuel economy for the longest time, but with different emphasis on different things. So when we first started talking about fuel economy in cars, people were particularly concerned about oil embargo, the fact that oil needs to be imported from countries that are not necessarily being very transparent about their pricing and their supply type of options and that kind of stuff. But only recently, we've actually seen a clearer and stronger connection between energy efficiency and fuel economy, of course, and CO2 emissions. And so you guys are probably familiar with the McKinsey report. So I'm taking a picture of the McKinsey report that I know will be shown in a future presentation in the session that follows me. So this is essentially the first time that using an engineering type of approach, so a bottom-up type of approach, the researchers that were part of the study actually managed to quantify how energy efficiency translates into savings in CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases. And they actually came to point out that in many cases, these savings are possible at negative or very low cost, which was, the big novelty, the big message that came out of this McKinsey report. They also went to the point of constructing what they call an energy efficiency supply curve. So they identified the different sectors or the different pieces of equipment. By sector, I mean the commercial sector or the residential sector, the industrial sector, and so forth. The pieces of equipment could be refrigerators, certain types of motors, certain type of engines, and so forth. And they went to the point of constructing the energy efficiency supply curve, which is going to be giving us the potential for energy efficiency to be realized. Now, we talk a lot about energy efficiency. You guys have heard the expression energy efficiency gap, which has been around forever and is essentially about the fact that people don't seem to be making the energy efficiency improvements that would save them a lot of money, even though those savings are possible. So these energy efficiency investments don't seem to have a lot of take-up. We also know that people are concerned about rebound effects that could potentially happen if there are improvements in the fuel efficiency, the energy efficiency of certain types of equipment. I'm not terribly concerned about the rebound effect. I think it's actually blown out of proportion a little bit in the literature. I think it's actually probably something that is really, really modest. So a lot of possible policies exist that could be used to improve energy efficiency in general and the fuel economy of cars in particular. There's regulation, there's incentives, all sorts of stuff. And something that I'm particularly interested in is pricing. So pricing could be influenced, for example, by imposing taxes like a carbon tax on the use of certain fuels. I'm also interested in looking at the potential adverse effects of these policies. So efficiency concerns, we generally think that pricing is more efficient than regulations because we're economists and we're trained to think in this way. But I'm also concerned about free riding. If you offer certain type of incentives, you may find out that the people that take them are the people that would have changed their equipment and done those energy efficiency improvements anyway, so that you're wasting public money, public revenue. So let me put up a little, let me move this a little bit on my screen and let me put up like a little formula here. So we're interested in quantifying the consumption of fuel associated with driving cars, for example. And we know that transportation and driving cars account for a fairly sizable portion of the total emissions. And so this is a sector of concern to us. So I can simply measure how many liters of fuel people are going to be consuming in a year, but I can also do an alternative calculation. I can point out that the consumption of fuel is simply the ratio between the number of kilometers that you travel over a certain period, so the driving that you do with your car, for example, over a year, divided by the fuel economy. So if you're driving 12,000 kilometers this year and the fuel economy of your car is such that 1 liter gets you 12 kilometers, then you're going to be using 1,000 liters this year. So let's calculate the elasticity of the consumption with respect to the price of gasoline, for example. So this is the expression that we see right here, and I don't know if you can see my cursor moving on the screen. I hope you can. But this is going to be the elasticity of fuel consumption with respect to the price of fuel. Well, it turns out that with some really simple math, you can actually break it down into two parts. One part is the elasticity of your driving, so how many miles you drive with respect to the price of fuel. And the other part, which you have to be subtracting, is the change or the elasticity in the fuel economy with respect to price. And so we're going to be concerned primarily with these two parts, which if we recombine them are going to be giving us the left-hand side of our equation. So first, we're going to be discussing a little bit the literature that we have on these two parts. So first of all, literature about the relationship between fuel consumption and fuel price. It's a huge literature that goes back probably to the 1970s when, you know, the first oil embargo were creating all sorts of problems to the Western world. We know that the price elasticity of fuel consumption is generally fairly low. So we're talking about, you know, maybe negative 0.1 to negative 0.2, something along these lines. I'd like to remind you that if you're interested in empirical work like I am, you're looking for opportunities to estimate the elasticity of consumption with respect to the fuel price by finding variation in the fuel price. And so this variation could happen over time. This variation could happen across places. And it could be due to fluctuations in the world price of oil, for example, in local demand and supply issues. You know, sometimes you have the refinery needs to be shut down for whatever problem, which changes the supply. And so the price is going to go up and you can see that fluctuation, that change out there. And in some cases, you can actually see changes that are brought by introducing or changing fuel taxes. Now, one paper that I wanted to mention about, you know, this particular type of investigation is a relatively recent paper by Rivers and Schaufele, a very dynamic Canadian duo. They actually studied the carbon tax that was first imposed in British Columbia and then extended to the rest of Canada, as we know. And they found that actually a 1% change in the gasoline price that is caused by market forces, so simple fluctuations in the world price of oil, has an elasticity of 0.42. But then if the change in price is coming from a tax, and in particular from a carbon tax, it turns out that the elasticity is fourfold. It's 4 times as big. It's actually bigger than 1 in this particular case, which is something that sort of, you know, contributes to a growing literature that is finding that people are actually more responsive to the changes in price that are coming from a tax than they are to the changes in price that are coming from fluctuations that are due to other factors like simple demand and supply or the activities of OPEC on the world market. So next topic that I want to talk about is the first of the two terms that we saw on the right-hand side of that expression. So the elasticity of driving with respect to fuel price. Again, you know, there's a large and very, very interesting literature about this that has had to deal with a number of empirical issues. The kilometers driven are not very elastic with respect to the price of gasoline. So people don't seem to be cutting down on their driving that much when the price of fuel increases. So some numbers, you know, that come from a fairly old literature review between a negative 0.09 and negative 0.31, indicating what I was just saying, that people are not very elastic with respect to the price of gasoline when it comes to the driven distance. There's also some indication that people are speculating about that maybe this elasticity is becoming less and less over time. So people are becoming even less responsive to changes in the price of gasoline, which could be due to a variety of reasons. There's a recent and very nice paper by Ken Gillingham and co-authors that actually collects data from existing cars, so cars that are really on the road, of different ages, so newish cars, less newish cars, less new cars, and so forth, that uses subsequent odometer readings to actually compute, fairly precisely what would be the annual kilometers driven or miles driven in that particular case. He finds that the price of elasticity is about negative 0.1, so about 10%, which is in line with the previous findings. But one of the things that he looks at this particular paper is whether we can identify certain types of cars that seem to be more responsive to the price of gasoline. It turns out that the ones that are more responsive are really the ones with a poor fuel economy, so the ones that have potential for improving in terms of cutting the driving, and also the ones that appear to be between 4 and 7 years of age, probably because they're the ones that are driven the most. And so when you're driving the most, you can probably try to cut down a little bit more. And then finally, the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is actually a really broad and really, really interesting part of the literature, and part of the literature that I also have been contributing to with my own research, is whether the fuel economy depends on fuel price. And so here the literature has been primarily concerned with looking at purchases of new cars and seeing if when the price of gasoline goes up, people are actually buying cars that are more efficient than in periods in which the price of gasoline is going down or is relatively stable or relatively low. So, but this is one of the most fascinating things is that, theory or general consideration would say, well, when the price of gasoline goes up, people should be buying more efficient cars. But the evidence is so mixed and it's so confusing that it's really difficult to come out with a consensus about this. So there's a very, very interesting paper by Justine Hastings and Jesse Shapiro that actually finds that when the price of gasoline goes up, people don't buy more fuel efficient cars. They simply substitute towards lower grade, lower quality of gasoline, which is less expensive, and they keep their old car. So that's a first, interesting finding that seems to be going against, what would be the received consensus. There's also a very, very nice paper by Ashley Langer and Doug Miller that finds that when the price of gasoline rises, actually manufacturers and dealerships will offer you special deals so that you can buy a car that is not particularly fuel efficient anyway. And so this is essentially making the responsiveness of individuals not very strong at all, which is another interesting finding. On the contrary, Bussi et al., and this is a very highly celebrated paper, looks at both the new car market and the old car market. And they find that actually when the price of gasoline goes up, the new car market adjusts in the sense that the share of fuel efficient vehicles will increase. Whereas the adjustment in the used car market is going to be primarily in the prices of vehicles. So if you have a car that is not particularly fuel efficient and you're trying to sell it, it's a used car and you're trying to sell it to someone, you are only going to be able to get a worse price. So you're going to be cashing in less when the price of gasoline is going up. Now, estimate of elasticities for new cars. There's a very nice paper by Clear and Lin that looks at monthly fluctuations in the price of gasoline in the US and finds that actually the fuel economy in new cars has a very, very small responsiveness to the price of gasoline. So the elasticity is negative 0.12. But this is not the lowest figure that you'll find for the elasticity because there's a subsequent paper, actually a paper that came out earlier, and is done in a different way by Lee, Timmins, and Bonhoeffer. They use registration data. And so they're not just looking at new cars, they're looking at new and existing cars. And they find that the elasticity of the fuel economy with respect to the price of gasoline is even smaller than I was expecting. So a 10% increase in fuel price will cause a 0.22% increase in the fuel economy in the short run, so given existing cars, and then a 2.04 increase in the fuel economy in the long run. Now, this is another way of saying that in the long run, the price elasticity of fuel economy is essentially 0.2, which is still a very, very low number, even when people are allowed to make all of the necessary adjustments. And one of their interesting findings is actually that when the fuel price increases, it has really two ways of affecting the fleet, the stock of cars out there. It redirects the sales towards more efficient model, but it also increases the scrappage of old cars. And so there's this kind of dual effect that needs to be taken into account. And finally, we have this paper by this dynamic duo, as I call them, Rivers and Schaufele. Once again, they're looking at fluctuations in the price of gasoline in Canada, and they find a very, very small effect of the price signal on improvements in the fuel economy. So we're talking about an elasticity of 0.08. So there's not really much consensus here, but the way that I read this literature is that it's first of all, empirically difficult to identify the effects of a change in the price signals on the fuel efficiency of cars. And the effects, however, seem to be generally fairly small. And this is primarily for new cars. And we want to see what happens, for example, for used cars or existing cars, and because the majority of the cars that are out there are really existing cars.
Anna,
so here, yes?
10 minutes.
Yes, thank you. So let's talk about what the engineering literature tells you a little bit about existing cars. So the engineering literature is primarily concerned about, looking at the discrepancy between the fuel economy as it is certified by the manufacturers and the government agency and what people are really experiencing on the road. And so they're able to develop, through empirical observations and regression, but also probably from wind tunnel type of analysis, they're able to develop a number of factors that are really going to be influencing the fuel economy on the road. So the cargo, how many people or how many things you're carrying in your car, the temperature, both directly and indirectly via the use of AC or heating, aerodynamics, whether you're putting something on the top of the car, your skis or your suitcases, and that's going to be messing you up, road conditions, weather, driving style, and all this kind of stuff. And last but not least, also how well your tires are inflated. An interesting finding from reports of drivers, that are contributing to some online data sets that have been analyzed by engineers, is that, it turns out that the fuel economy on the road is explained primarily by the official fuel economy, with a small contribution of the mass of the vehicle, so the weight, the engine size, the manufacturing year. And there is this concern that, the discrepancy between the official agency certified fuel economy and the one that people are really experiencing on the road is actually, this discrepancy is actually getting bigger over time. So these are some of the considerations that we want to take into account. We want to take them into account and analyze them with a data set that I've been using with Marco Orvath and Colin Vance, a data set from Germany, which gives me the opportunity to calculate both how people are going to be adjusting their driving in terms of kilometers as the price of gasoline changes, as well as adjusting their driving fuel economy. So are they going to be driving in a more fuel economy fashion as the price of gasoline changes? This data set is the German mobility panel. Some of you guys may be familiar with it or even have worked with it already, but this has been my first time with it. It started in 1997, and when a household is participating, they participate for 3 years in a row, and then they're rotated out. We're using the data from 2004 to 2019, so we're using a fairly long stretch. We start from 2004 primarily because of quality of the data type of issues. In the German mobility panel, every single time in the spring, there is a survey in which, over 7 weeks, in which every single time you're going to the gas station, you're going to have to take down the odometer reading, how much gasoline you're buying in terms of liter, what the price is, and how much you're paying. And this is repeated many times so that the mobility panel people can actually calculate from this 7-week period your monthly kilometer driven and also the average fuel economy that you're experiencing. And these are going to be the things that we're going to be focusing on. So we're going to be estimating 2 equations. The first one is the fuel economy equation. And everything is going to be in logs because, as you will see shortly, everything just works better with logs. So we're going to be taking the fuel economy as you experience on the road for a particular car in that particular year. And we're going to be regressing that on the official fuel economy, or we would like to, because as we can see, we need to proxy for that, on the fuel prices, on characteristics of the car, like the age of the car, and characteristics of the family, and characteristics of the road that are likely to influence your fuel economy. As I mentioned, or as you can see on the slide, I don't really have the fuel economy of the vehicle, but I do have the engine size and the horsepower and the fuel type and the make and the year that it was manufactured, which are excellent proxies for the official fuel economy. So I stick those in the equation and I find myself with this expression right here. So I have the log of the fuel economy. I regress that on the log of the fuel price, characteristics of the car, characteristics of the family, characteristics of the location, and fixed effects, which I'll describe later. Then I have a second equation that comes from a demand for kilometers driven. So the kilometers driven are going to be a function of the price per unit, which is the price per kilometer, income, household characteristics, location characteristics, and so forth. And by the time I'm taking logs and I'm substituting and this and that, I'm getting an expression that looks like this. So the log of the monthly kilometer driven is going to be regressed on the log of the fuel price. It's going to be regressed on car characteristics like the weight and the horsepower and what kind of make it is and when it was manufactured. family characteristics, location characteristics, and the fixed effects. So in summary, I have a system of two unrelated equations, so a seemingly unrelated regression system. The regressors are the same in both equations, which means that I can just round OLS equation by equation. I got the log of fuel price on the right-hand side in both cases. And importantly, we need to talk about the fixed effects, because the fixed effects are supposed to help us take care of unobserved heterogeneity. So we could have car fixed effects, because remember that we have subsequent observations from the same car. But it turns out that if I do that, I'm unable to distill out the impact of the characteristics of the car, because they're essentially going to be absorbed into the car fixed effects. So I don't want to do that. What I do want to do is I want to use household fixed effects, and that takes advantage of the fact that a household is followed over different periods, and there's potentially numerous cars per household. And also I want to be using Kreis by year fixed effect. So the Kreis is essentially a jurisdiction, a small jurisdiction in Germany. So that would be essentially the county in the US, or maybe the provincia in Italy or something like that. And by using Kreis by year fixed effects, I'm trying to account for all sorts of road characteristics, construction work that could be going on the roads, but also demand and supply shocks that are likely to be influence both your behavior as well as potentially the price of gasoline. And that's really important. So we will be looking at heterogeneity in a number of ways by doing separate regressions and also by estimating latent class models. I'm going to be skipping the explanation of the latent class model because I don't think I'm going to have enough time, but I will be coming back to the results from the latent class model. So briefly, my sample, I have about 5,600 households. Not everybody participates in all of the required 3 waves. Some people drop out sooner, but we still have a fairly good distribution in terms of the number of waves that they were able to participate in. We have over 8,000 cars, and it turns out that in the German mobility panel, the majority of the cars are really gasoline cars. Good news, company cars are only 6% of the observation, so they're not going to be doing any sort of undue influence on my results, which are really going to be based on private type of cars. The majority of the households have 1 car, but we still have it that more than a quarter of the households have, 2 cars or more. We looked at vehicle turnover. It was sufficiently small that we can actually run some regression in which I'm holding the stock of cars owned by the household the same. And let me give you a little bit of the description of the data here. So this is the histogram of the annual kilometers driven. So I'm taking the monthly kilometers and I'm multiplying that by 12, so that it gives you a figure that you can compare with the Italian or French or Spanish, equivalents. So needless to say, people that drive diesel cars are driving more miles, and that's the reason why you're buying a diesel car in the first place. You're not going to be terribly surprised by seeing that the distribution of the miles driven for gasoline cars in blue and for diesel car in pink is going to be positively skewed, because that's normally the way it is. So let's keep this in mind and look at the fuel economy. So once again, the fuel economy of diesel cars has a distribution that is shifted to the right relative to that of gasoline cars, and that's not a surprise. We know that diesel cars are more efficient, and that's the reason why people buy them. So people that need to drive more miles for personal or professional reasons will tend to buy diesel cars, although in Germany to a less extent than they would do, for example, in Italy or in France. Now, remember what I was saying earlier about the fact that the difference between the real on-the-road fuel economy and the official fuel economy from when you're buying a new car seems to be changing over time, seems to be getting bigger according to some of the earlier studies over time. So I have all of the new car sales in Germany from another data set from 2011 all the way to 2019. And I can actually plot what the fuel economy would be of the new cars that are sold in Germany. And I can compare that with the cars that are in the German mobility panel, which include new cars, but also old cars. So you can see the difference here. So the red is the fuel economy of the new cars sold in Germany in that particular year. And you can see that the fuel economy is going up very sharply up to about 2016, when it sort of plateaus and then it sort of comes down a little bit. Whereas in the German mobility panel, the improvement is much more subtle. So it improves by about 1 liter per kilometer all the way over these 9 years. And so you can see that the line is much flatter than before, which is something that we want to keep in mind. Fuel prices during my study period were actually fluctuating quite a bit. And you guys probably recognize that this was the spike coming from the oil market, just before the big recession of 2008. the prices came crashing down because, of course, the economy was not very good at all in that period in 2008, 2009, and then they came up again. But they've been fluctuating nicely, and that's good. We also have some cross-sectional fluctuations, although that's not as pronounced as the time type of fluctuations, and we can take advantage of that. Main results, because I am probably going to be running out of time fairly soon. So first of all, I want you to look at the results that are highlighted in yellow here. We have a total of 4 columns because I'm running 2 regressions and I'm running them twice. One time I'm including all of my fixed effects, and this is the time in which I'm also including household fixed effects. The other time I'm not including household fixed effects because I want to focus on household characteristics and how they improve the fuel economy or don't improve it, and how they change the kilometers driven or how they don't change it. So big results here. So first of all, the coefficient on fuel price, or the log of fuel price, is indicating the elasticity. It's actually negative and significant. So this should be interpreted as follows. If you have a gasoline car, when the price of gasoline goes up, somehow you're going to be rearranging your driving. You're going to be doing something different that actually hurts your fuel economy. You're actually making it worse when the price of gasoline goes up, which is a very surprising result. Now, in this row here, I also have the interaction between the fuel price and the fact that you have a diesel car. And so the elasticity for these people, for people with diesel car, for the diesel car itself, is the sum of these 2 coefficients. And you can see quite clearly that they cancel each other out. So that's another way of saying that if you have a diesel car, you're pretty much unaffected by changes in the fuel price. When it comes to the kilometers driven, you can see that if you have a gasoline car, you have a price elasticity of kilometers driven of about 0.25, which is well reasonable, very significant, and very reasonable compared to previous estimates from the literature all over the world. But then if you have a diesel car, remember that you have to sum these 2, and they're pretty much canceling themselves out. So big finding here, which gets confirmed when I separate the data into diesel cars and gasoline cars. If you have a gasoline cars, you are much more responsive to changes to the price signal, to the price of gasoline, but in the wrong direction when it comes to the fuel economy, and in the right direction when it's coming to the kilometers driven. If you have a diesel car, I think this is the situation in which you have a some sort of a intensive versus extensive type of margin. So you're buying a diesel car because you need to drive more and because you need to have a more efficient car, but you're not affected by the price signal once you're locked into a diesel car. So these results are remaining pretty much the same if I'm adding household fixed effects. By the way, household characteristics don't seem to be important at all in explaining the fuel economy, but they do seem to be important in explaining the miles driven. So we did a bunch of checks for this. So we separated the data into gasoline cars and diesel cars, and they confirm exactly the story that I told you. We looked at 1-car households versus 2 or more car households, and it turns out that if you have more than 1 car, you are probably more responsive because you're able to rearrange your driving across the different households. You're not as responsive with the mileage if you only have 1 car, but you're more responsive in the wrong direction in terms of the fuel economy. We tried, holding the stock of cars the same, and we pretty much the same results, which was very, very interesting to us. And so what's this? And we tried all sorts of things, looking at household members and that kind of stuff, and that always pretty much confirms the same result. So what's going on here? So we have a story, I believe, that gets interpreted as extensive versus intensive margin. But what's going on here? Is it possible that the same behavior that you're engaging in to reduce your miles driven are also the ones that make your fuel economy get worse when the price increases? So I can imagine, for example, combining many household members in the same car that increases the cargo, decreases the fuel economy. You could be driving more in the city, giving up long drives where you can actually keep the speed of the car optimal for fuel consumption purposes. So I can imagine that some of this kind of stuff going on, but I don't have enough evidence from this particular data to be able to point you in the right direction. This will remain for future research. But this is something to keep in mind. We're getting one type of effect in response to the price signal, but it's damaging the other. And so it's making the overall consumption less responsive to the price change. Quickly about the latent class model. If you are familiar with latent class models, that's
Anna,
great.
1 minute.
Okay, then I'm just going to show you the results here. So if you're working with a latent class model, that means that you believe that there's different groups of people. People falling in one group are similar to one another in terms of behavior and regression results, but they're different across the groups. And the problem is that you don't know which group a driver or a car will fall into. The bottom line is that we're never able to identify more than two groups. For the fuel economy, we find that one of these two groups, group 2, which seems to be comprised of people that were already starting at a higher level of fuel economy, they are completely insensitive to it. When it comes to looking at the responsiveness of kilometers driven, it turns out that the two classes that we have are equally responsive, but one class, and this would be the pink one, class 2, is actually more likely to be comprised of people that clearly have more constraints. They have more kids, they're working, they're high to mid income, and they drive more. This is actually a posterior representation of the elasticities, which actually seem to be constrained within a very, very small interval for gasoline cars in terms of the kilometers driven. They're much broader when we're looking at the fuel consumption overall in liters for gasoline cars. Bottom line, and this is really the last few things that I'm going to be saying, so I'm not going to be over time for much more than 1 minute. So bottom line, we know that transition to electric cars and to alternative type of fuels is not going to be immediate. So at least in the short run, we're going to have to look at the responsiveness to price signals, which could be a price signal could be including a carbon tax, for example. We find that for existing cars, at least for gasoline cars and at least for Germany, the overall elasticity of consumption with the price signal is impaired by the fact that people seem to be driving with a worse fuel economy when the price signal, when the price goes up. In terms of, what would be the implication for possible values of a carbon tax, it would have a very, very small impact on the emissions coming from passenger cars, given the type of responsiveness that we see. So this is something that we want to keep in mind for policy prescription, for sort of orchestrating the switch to a completely completely electric type of fleet. So essentially, with this, sort of review of the literature and bringing in some recent results, I'm hoping that I am raising the question as to whether the fuel economy is really the weakest link when it comes to looking at the responsiveness to price signal in the direction of changing our consumption of fossil fuels and reducing emissions. So we find that we have an adverse effect in terms of the fuel economy. Fuel prices in the literature have been found to have very small effect on new car purchases. And this is about cars, but you can imagine that a similar type of story in which people are not able to adjust their behavior or their purchases very much could be going on for other equipment that is using electricity, for example, like refrigerators, washing machines, and that kind of stuff. So here I'm raising the question, are people locked into the energy efficiency or the fuel economy decisions that they make at the time of the purchase of the car? And are they pretty much sticking with that forever and unable to respond to the price signals? So what do we do in terms of limiting the adverse effect of this? Do we offer them more incentives to purchase cars with different type of fuels or different type of fuel economies? If we do that, are we going to be triggering free riding type of behavior? So these are not really conclusions, they're just unanswered type of questions, but I believe that they deserve further consideration given what we have found and given what other people in the literature have found. And I'm stopping with this. Thank you very much for your attention. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Anna. Fantastic ending and very interesting, very broad view. I learned a lot from your presentation, just as I was desiring from such a lecture, I would say. I'm afraid we are a bit out of time, so we don't have time for questions. But maybe, okay, let's steal 1 or 2 minutes from the session, because I wanted to ask you a couple of things. First, you mentioned the lock-in as possible reality. Now, I was wondering whether the locked-in effect might become even bigger in the future after COVID, because your data went up to now and things are going to change drastically maybe, and so we might even be more locked into the past because we have less money or things like that. And my other question is is there a consideration on time constraints when making decisions? Can time be a constraint that locked us into energy inefficiency? For instance, I don't have time to look after the gasoline price or look for a new car, and in the end, I'm not responsive at all.
It seems to me that time may well be. It seems to me that wealth of people may well be also another reason why people may not be paying that much attention or may not be realizing that whatever behavior they do to cut on the kilometers is actually going to be hurting them on the side of the fuel economy. You know, these are fluctuations in the price of gasoline. Some of them are fairly large that were experienced over my study period. But remember that this is also a study period where, with the only exception of 2008, 2009, you know, people were fairly well off. I think that Germany actually, even in 2008, 2009, was doing really well compared to the rest of the world. So I think that both, you know, time consideration as well as money consideration, that this is not that important or a big part of the family budget, are going to be playing a role. In terms of what's happening now because of COVID, I think we're going to be suffering the results of this for quite a while. I think that while COVID has diminished emissions because of diminished economic activity and because people are working at home and not driving to work, has played a role and will play a role. And I don't know how long it's going to take for car markets and car replacement behavior to adjust after this. That would be, if I had that answer, that would be what we call the $64,000 question.
Sure. There is one question from Andreas. I think Andreas wanted to ask a question.
Yes.
Well, thanks a lot, Anna, for this interesting presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I just wanted to give a comment, or probably as well a question, because you talked about the new carbon tax that we are implementing in Germany. And
Yes.
I just wanted to share with you one observation which annoyed me. Whenever you read newspapers at this time in Germany, you always get this information that gasoline prices are going to increase sharply, because of these new taxes. And I mean, you made the point that changes in taxes might be much more effective than changes in prices. And it's really interesting because nominal prices of gasoline, of course, have decreased over the last 10 years in Germany. And now we have this discussion that now we have this increase of 7 cents for gasoline prices, as you have highlighted. And it seems to be really a major issue. And I think that would be, I mean, as you are now working with this type of data and working on these issues, I think that would be very interesting to study.
Right. Thank you for raising this point. So I don't know if the Canadians, the behavior of the Canadians and the behavior of in the US, can be extrapolated to Germany. But remember that, in a number of studies, people were found to be much more responsive to the changes in the tax. And so if that were the case, so we did some simple calculations. And remember, these are back of the envelope that assume that everything stays the same and should be taken with a grain of salt, of course. But we did some calculations and effectively the elasticity and the effect would be 4 times as big if we apply those findings to Germany. I don't have enough evidence yet. And remember that we're in a COVID situation, so it's really difficult to disentangle the signal. I don't have any evidence yet if people are more responsive to tax changes in Germany. What I do know is that in the US and in Canada, the fluctuations in gasoline prices are much more massive than you see them in Europe, where there's more taxes. So whenever the oil price is cheap, people don't really get the immense discounts or immense reductions in the price of gasoline because the taxes are sort of cushioning things. But likewise, when the price is going up, there's also this cushioning effect of taxes, which changes the signal that people are getting from market. But thanks for raising that, because we were really looking at the proposed, carbon tax in Germany. We were doing this kind of calculations, assuming that nothing changes. And of course, with the estimates of price elasticity that we find, there wouldn't be much of a reduction in emissions, but that would change if the Canadian results apply to Germany as well. So I'll keep a hawk eye on the situation. Thanks for this comment.
I pick up a last question, then we have to move on to the session from Stefano Verde. Stefano is asking, could the negative coefficient on fuel economy be explained by substitution between gasoline and diesel cars at the time of the vehicle choice, given diesel prices are lower than gasoline prices?
Perhaps. So remember that we're dealing with a panel where there are some changes in cars and there are some people that are buying new cars, but this is not the same, it's not a big proportion of the sample. But remember that we also dropped those people that somehow get rid of their car or acquire a car or replace one car with another, and the results are still the same. So we also try to look at, what happens if I stay with families that only have gasoline cars or only diesel cars or a combination, and the results are still the same. So I'm not sure that, I'm sure that there's some substitution going on among your existing cars, and it would make sense that you're trying to switch your mileage or kilometers to your more efficient car. But I'm not sure that buying new diesel cars is an explanation for this. And for the record, actually, the Germans have been buying fewer diesel cars over time. Partly because of Dieselgate, perhaps, partly because diesel bans were considered in many cities or implemented in some cases in some cities in Germany. But diesel is not as popular in Germany as it is, for example, in Italy, or as it was until recently in France.
Okay.
I do have a diesel car, by the way.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anna. I apologize with the others. There are other questions coming, but we really have to go on. Please, I invite you to go on a bilateral basis, and there is also the chat if you want to answer later on.